This location is very beautiful. The scenery is absolutely gorgeous, especially in the fall time. However, there is a sense of somberness. There is a sense of despair, of brokenheartedness, of feeling the heavy weight of knowing that people lost their lives here. Innocent women lost their lives here. There is a feeling of death.
They call it the Highway of Death. It's a lonely stretch of road in western Connecticut where half a dozen young women and a man have been murdered and their bodies dumped. It was a yesteryear story, a nightmare hanging over from the 1980s and 90s, unsolved, unresolved, and the killer still uncaught. Until 3 years ago, when the same thing happened. A young woman's body was discovered in exactly the same area. Welcome to CrimeWaves. What's it like when you get the call about a potential homicide, a body's been found, something like that? What goes through your mind and your heart at those moments?
Actually, it's more cerebral than heart-based, to be quite honest with you.
Yep.
Often it's the middle of the night, so you're trying to wake up enough to drive safely. And then there's really just technicalities that are in play. We ask the infamous questions, is the scene secured? Are you sure? Is anybody surviving that, going to hospital so we could get detectives there, maybe get, dying declarations or statements. And then, we have to determine whether we need a legal process. Is this in an open public domain where there's no Fourth Amendment rights protection, or is it in a home? Right. So you're in their curtilage, they still have a protection. Right. And now, if you find a body in a state forest or a public park, fair game. Like we don't, nobody's got a claim of privacy there. But these are always questions we're asking, and there's time intervals, right? So let's say we think we do need a search warrant. It may be a 4 or 5 hour process by the time we get it all done and signed by the judge. And so now we're thinking, okay, is it an outdoor scene? Do we have bad weather coming? Do we have to try to protect the scene? Worry about the decomposing body, time of death issues. So these are all, so you start just clinically or mechanically thinking about, what do we need to know? What do I need to make sure we're doing with the minimum amount of information I currently have, so we reduce the chance of mistakes early on?
Yeah, because I remember you and I did a podcast a couple of years ago called Murder in Our Town, about a murder up in Salisbury, Connecticut, where you guys arrived on the crime scene and bang, from nowhere comes a rainstorm and just wipes out all the physical evidence on the crime scene.
That was the Dunst case, and it was a very important murder, and we lost a ton of evidence because of a monsoon. It wasn't small rain, and there was nothing we could do about it. So yeah, and you worry about that. You really do worry about that.
So your mind takes over, and I'm sure you must receive training or some, so that your heart doesn't kick in. Oh my gosh, I mean, mine certainly would as an untrained person. If somebody phoned me at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, okay, you go investigate this potential murder, but yours doesn't. Most of the time it's clicking into the mental, this is what we got to do. This is what we got to know.
It really could depend. I mean, you could be, in an inner city, we had a crime scene which involved, believe it or not, a 14-year-old kid with a submachine gun, and he and his friends had jacked cars and did violent robberies for a period of a couple months down in the Bridgeport area. And on this particular night, there was patrol cars near enough now that they engaged him. Had no idea he was 14, and chased him in a back alleyway. He jumped, over a fence. They jumped with him. They saw the submachine gun. He dropped it, picked it up, aimed at the officer, he shot and killed him. And he would have been certainly dead if he hadn't done that.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, we just showed up the scene, and it's in, a really condensed area in Bridgeport. and we're like, this is going to be really hard to secure. And it just happened that the 10 o'clock news was coming on, and one of the local news stations went there, and they got a clip from somebody in the neighborhood, and they said that um, we saw the police execute this kid. With that, the entire neighborhood erupted. They started rioting. They started dumping over our police cars, and we literally had to grab the body and run for our lives. There's almost nothing else that we could do. So
those are the extreme ones. One is a case where the rain wipes out your crime scene. Another one is where the neighborhood, because of misinformation or whatever it's called these days, riots and turns it into a war zone. In the particular cases that Elizabeth and I have been looking at over the last few months, it's a lonely, deserted country laneway. Is this a moment where your emotions take over, or you just like, hey mate, I don't have time for emotions at this point. I'm a crime scene investigator. What?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we're overly callous, and I think early on, maybe you're more emotional. Unfortunately, you probably get a bit hardened. You don't really get tied into any emotions unless it's a child. Like for me, a child always, from moment one, like those are tough cases. Right? They always really bother me.
Of course.
Other than that, it's usually when it gets tough is the days and weeks that follow. Where now you start talking to the family members and interviewing them. And in the cases we're going to be talking about here, we did, and they were lovely people, who were heartbroken over, troubles that their daughters had been having and now were violently killed. So eventually, yes, you do hit an emotional
not at
thing,
that
but
moment, not as you're walking into the crime scene. You are listening to a special edition of CrimeWaves about the Highway of Death. It's a small stretch of the Route 8 in Western Connecticut where half a dozen bodies were dumped after being killed by a serial murderer. This episode is researched and produced by my student, Elizabeth Scalzo, and features Tim Pombach, a former leader of the Connecticut State Police Major Crimes Unit and a professor of forensic science here at the University of New Haven. If you find this episode interesting, please subscribe, like, follow, rate us on whatever podcast platform you follow. It's massively important for our program. Now, back to the episode. What's the first thing, or one of the first things that you do when you approach a potential scene that there could be a crime or there's a body there?
So let's look at again, you want to talk about this isolated area in the western part of Connecticut, off the Route 8. So it's going to be easy to secure that scene. There's just not a lot of anybody around, right? And limited roads and access. So it's pretty easy to kind of isolate you. You have plenty of time. So that's all like a plus. Like, okay,
right,
we can slow down. There's a lot of things that normally could go bad. We don't have to worry about going bad here. And we're going to have time. Now, the flip side of that is, okay, there is nothing around. So, the modern world now is the second a crime happens, everybody runs for CCTV cameras. Where's the nearest camera, right? Well, there isn't anything out there. Also, from a crime scene perspective, it is pitch black. It is wildly dark, and you're going to need as much auxiliary lighting as you can possibly get. And like I said, in a case like that, we'll do what we have to in the dark. You usually be focusing on the body and the evidence around the body, making a removal, and then we'll buy some time and wait for sunlight to help us out because working in the dark is hard. But those become, the instant challenges. Just the remote nature is a plus. It's also a challenge, and it also begins. Everybody's mind is like, is this likely just a dump site? Somebody just did what they did somewhere else, and we got a body dump here. And particularly in the cases we'll talk about, where we started having more than one body in the area, became more and more concerned that that's exactly what it was. Now, you also don't know that that's true.
Right.
They could easily be taking people there voluntarily, by force, by drugging, whatever, and all the activity could be happening there as well. So you have to be open-minded that it could be both a primary crime scene as well as a secondary.
Tim, you're not only and are not only an academic, not only active against human trafficking. We've spoken about that, but you're also a police officer, but also a homicide detective, a major crimes thing. And I always have a sense, when I'm reading a murder mystery or I'm looking at one of these TV programs, you have the regular cops and then you have the elite guys like you or the detectives. Let's assume for this question that I'm a completely untrained regular cop. What is the number one thing that you would tell that cop in terms of one of these
And is
crimes?
their role is very important, and I think they underestimate their role. I mean, they are the first set of eyes, trained eyes, on that scene, and so it's so important that however they can absorb that or record that information, we're not asking them to walk through the whole crime scene and take photographs and sketches, but you have a camera, start taking a couple before you ever walk it, whatever you can do. And then be as careful as you can to think about, in the case of a body, he has a job, she has a job to go make sure that nobody needs medical attention, and that's going to trump. We got that. Once you realize that's not the case, then they should take a big step back and try to avoid any potential for damage of the evidence. But also it's just kind of like a look around. Who's there? Did I pass a car or a truck coming into the scene? It's those initial observations that are so important, and they're the best person to be aware of them. And now the question is, did they remember it, and will they record it? Will we ever know about that? Yeah.
Yes. The geography of this particular set of murders is particularly eerie. It's a highway here in Connecticut where over years, over decades, a number of bodies were found in this area. What role did geography play in this case?
It's really, really important. And you have two sets of geography, right? So and by the way, there were multiple victims in this area, and there were some differences between them. One even being male, but there were several that were female, and they were residents of the city of Waterbury, which was about, I don't know, 40 minutes, maybe half hour south of there, in the area where it was very rural, just north of there. So you had two geographic considerations. Where did these victims come from, right? And they're all coming from the city of Waterbury. And with a little bit of victimology, victim background, you find out that many of them, right, were from even a fairly discrete area of the city. Many of them had history of drug arrests and or prostitution or association in those communities. So that's one set of geography. Now, in this case, the other weird part is, why are you up in the middle of absolutely nowhere?
Yeah.
A half hour away in a very rural community. And you might jump the logic and say, because nobody can will see you there. Well, yes and no. Nobody will see, there's not going to be a CCTV camera catching you there, but if you're the only car on the road, which could be the case, then anything that could happen, you might stand out. Or just think about the local trooper or the local resident trooper in the area going through those areas, is going to be very aware of any particular car moving in the mid hours of the night. So he may target you very quickly. So
Right.
it's and then quite honestly, people are going to be they're going to be very uncomfortable being if they, let's say they picked up a girl in the city, and for them then to drive out to the middle of nowhere, one of the geographic first clues is they must be familiar with that area. This wasn't just a shot in the dark. Well, they went there for some particular reason, and that gets very hard as to what that reason could be.
My understanding was that the rest stop nearby had been used as a kind of I'm searching for the right word. I'll say sexual playground, both either professional or amateur. So there was some knowledge of that location as a site of recreational sex anyway.
True, but different, because what all the recreational sex that became aware of police and had police intervention over the years, was all homosexual based, right? It was guys paying for hooking up with other guys. and maybe not always paying for it, but that was the activity that was kind of notorious over many, many years in that general area. Now, most of these girls weren't found in that, pulled over part of the rest area, which is now, by the way, closed down.
Mm-hmm.
But as the crow flies, you're like just heading east, through the woods, kind of as it were, into a very wooded area. So if somebody had gone past the rest area and got off at the next exit off the highway and then kind of looped back around behind this wooded area where adjacent to the highway and the rest area, that's where they were found. So they geographically were very close, although somewhat different locations. And but again, I think geographically the important distinction is where most of those bodies were found was actually even far more removed. It wasn't necessarily an easy place to know about or find, which again heightened our curiosity or focal point that it has to be somebody. There was a local hunting club in the area, so that was a consideration. Who are the members? There are a few houses in the area, so it was like it was somebody's grandmother lived on the road. I mean, so you begin looking at anything that could connect a person to going to such of a remote area that it wouldn't seem like it was accidental.
What are those sites common?
They're not uncommon. I know that, and I'll give you an example. Many of the homicides I worked on were also bodies that were literally thrown out of a car along the Merritt Parkway in Fairfield County in Connecticut, and right over from the New York line. And several of them were victims that had identified came out of New York City. So there it was somebody, did whatever they did, had the body in the trunk of the car, wherever they did, and as soon as they could get to a somewhat remote place, which if you were driving on the Merritt Parkway, Route 15, and you got into Connecticut, it looked pretty remote. And so they would just, boom, get rid of the body there. Sometimes they lit them on fire, put them in tires, but there were many. So it's not uncommon for bodies to be disposed of off of major highways or routes when the person doing it feels like there's a little bit of solitude or a less of a chance of being seen.
But this one seems, and there've been others. The student here today who's producing this, Elizabeth, and I went through a number of cases, and it just seems odd that the murderer, the killer, would keep returning to the same place. Surely there's, you murder somebody and then you dump them there. The very last place you want to do is return it with the second one and the third one, because the risk now is being heightened. But we found many cases like that, remote areas, but people will return. Do you have any sense of why somebody would do this? Is this a token?
And I agree with you, but they do it. And we're not, I'm not sure what the logic is, why they go back there. It's got to be something symbolic. There's some reason for that. The other potential is, and we certainly consider it, and you have to consider, is you got a copycat. Because it's publicly known, it gets out in the press where a body was found. I mean, nobody hides that.
Yes.
The identity of the victim is publicly known, that's out there, and you know where they came from. So that was all public information. And so anybody could have known that, and they may have just said, hey, I can maybe get a freebie here. I can off somebody, mix it in here, and hopefully not get caught. So you're always worried about that as well when you have multiple victims over a period of time, and you've had publicity about those locations. It's like, is somebody copycatting me?
Yeah, because we spent considerable time looking at contemporary serial killers at that time. Now, there's obviously been a body dumped in that area, I think 2.5, 3 years ago. So there's a certain freshness about this. Freshness is the wrong word, but current issue going on. But we were looking in New Bedford, Massachusetts around that time. There was also a serial killer killing sex workers in that area. There was somebody in the Green River out in the west of the United States. Again, same modus operandi. We were trying to figure out, was there any linkage between the people who were convicted of that case and maybe these early cases in the 80s and 90s, and then what we had later was a copycat. How do you do that when you're working an investigation? Are you looking around? Is there a database? What do you do?
So I mean, yeah, there are databases like VICAP would be one of them, and they're far more robust now than they were in back in the days when I was working these cases. Also, in addition to everything you mentioned, those absolutely were serial killer events. There was a lot in Connecticut in the 80s and 90s. It was frightening. You know, you had Michael Ross down in the southeast part of the state. You know, eventually he was identified and convicted for killing many young girls, and they mostly were just young girls from the community. Um, we had in Hartford two serial killer working in the 90 area, and they both led to the identification and arrest of individuals. One was a gentleman named Matthew Johnson, who was in Connecticut for a period of time that did the killings and then moved on, and eventually a really challenging forensic case, DNA case, really challenging. Because we had thousands and thousands of samples that were all co-contaminated. And one of the problems, if you actually have a victim that's a sex worker, is um, you have everything's a mixture.
Of course.
And
Yes.
and so when you get mixture samples, you can't just go throw it up in the CODIS database and get a good clean answer. It gets really complex.
Right.
And so eventually we did identify Matthew Johnson there, and he was convicted.
Good man.
Um,
Good work.
and they were all girls that were basically walking the streets, working the bars, and he picked them up and he killed them, you know, in little remote locations within the city of Hartford. So the short answer is there's lots of activity going on in this little tiny area of Connecticut in that area. So um, you really you just couldn't logically say this is one guy just going crazy. It didn't. Well, actually we proved in many cases it wasn't that. You know, so I think what we've been able to establish for these kinds of cases in the area is a logical kind of patterning, right? You go back to Michael Ross, he was in that area,
Mm.
right? He targets certain girls. These Hartford cases, they were in parts of the city, you know, engaging with girls in that area. And
Yeah,
so for not all, but many of the victims in the Ruggiero case coming out of this little area, you know, or segment of Waterbury, the expectation was, you know, that's where the interaction begins. That's the familiarity. That's where our suspect is engaging them, right?
moving on to the psychology of these sick individuals, particularly in relation to the Green River killer, you know, Highway 8, it's right beside a river. I was wondering if there was some kind of connection, you know, with the vagina because it was a valley, it was wet, it was, you know, covered in trees and stuff. There was some weird psychological deficiency in these serial killers' minds on like that. Let me ask you, and again, this is a psychological question. You're an investigator, that's not your field, but again, we were going through the cases right back to Jack the Ripper in London in the 1890s, where these sick serial killers are killing sex workers. Any sense of why they target these women?
Um, so this is I'm going to answer your question. It sound like I'm not going to. And if you some of my colleagues who may hear this, you know, the first thing in their mind is say, Poundback, not no freaking way. You hate profilers,
Right.
and I'm going to be like, I don't hate them. We've come to a disagreement on many occasions, but I think there's very good reason why. My job, right? And more of it is focused on the crime scene evidence than it is the investigative side. I've done both, right? But so when I say my job, I'm talking more about the science side of it. It cannot be. If I allow it to become biased, it
Yes.
becomes irrelevant.
Yes, of course.
And therefore I don't have I shouldn't engage in the why. And you know, you talked early on, you know, do you get overwhelmed with emotion? I'm like, I can't afford to do that. I'm looking for data,
Yes.
evidence, linkages between the evidence and, you know, between the victims and the scenes and the suspects. And to the extent I can keep that a pure process, it will yield better information, more reliable information for the investigators ultimately have to put this thing together. And, you know, again, often I was doing that as well. So is it valuable? Yes, it is valuable. Have I seen it be beneficial? Yes. Have I seen it been wrong? Yes. um, it's the I kind of believe the two worlds can't coexist. I know people disagree with me. That I'm like, if you're looking at it from a behavioral point of view, that's one perspective. If you're looking at it from a forensic point of view, that's another perspective. If you're an investigator and you're doing interviews and you're reading people out and you're considering geographical location, that's a different perspective. And the best case scenario is those three worlds kind of work independently, unbiased, and then they come together and it coalesces and it gels, and you really end up with a good answer in the best case scenario.
Yeah, I think the Golden State Killer, there was a psychological thing. And just to review for listeners who don't know that particular case, a serial rapist murderer in California, and the police officers, the investigators back in the 70s and 80s, when he was at his height of terror, were convinced that he was a former police officer or a military man of some kind, because he always seemed to know what they were about to do next. And he was dropping taunting phone calls saying, "Oh, you're just about to do blah, blah, blah. Well, I've destroyed all the," those kind of taunting calls. And so fast forward decades later, when they have a new technology called forensic genealogy, and they were narrow down the DNA involved in this case from over 1 million suspects, 1 million men between those ages in California at that time, to 300. And then they could go, okay, let's put this psychological profile, see if those original investigators were right. Narrowed it down to 14 because that was just easier to do in terms of resources. And then bingo, it was one of those guys. It could as well, moving back to this particular case, just be men who hate women, and the women who are working the streets in that very dangerous occupation are just the easiest targets.
Yeah, and I think that is it probability wise likely going to be the right answer. But you look at the worst case scenario is kind of the Dexter scenario.
You're investigated with a huge amount of experience. What's the difference between investigating a current investigation where the phone calls come in at 2 a.m, 2 p.m, 6 o'clock, whatever, and you're pounding out the door, and I'm going to put this in quotations, a cold case investigation? How do you approach these differently, and if so, how?
Sure. Look at so a fresh scene. You again, perfect world. You have everybody in their lane doing their work unbiased. Your crime scene people are collecting evidence, right? Your MEs making initial determinations. Your investigators are talking to everybody and anybody. Somebody's looking for CCT cameras. Somebody's all of this is going on, and it's a fast pace. Boom, 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 boom. If you ever go into a task force room or a homicide division room as a case is coming in, it's really busy, right?
Right.
Tips are coming in, and things are getting assigned, and
I mean, you've
one
got
of
that
the
48
biggest
hours that people talk about,
yeah,
that infamous 48 hours. If you can solve in 48 hours, it's done.
yeah. One of the biggest challenges is kind of the case officer, the supervisor in charge, riding everybody because they're going 100 miles an hour. Now they're into day 2, they haven't slept, and they're like, and they're saying everything you do, you've got to document. Now, early on, maybe it's a notepad you can turn into a report later on, but you have to document, because one of the biggest things is when the years go by and now becomes a cold case. I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Right.
Memory's gone. It's over. And if 30% of what you experienced and understood while you were doing the case never made it to paper, that is gone forever. The chance of you remembering that is almost none. And if you really have a cold case, generally speaking, what it means is you just came up a little bit short in most cases. It's not like every now and then it's a complete unknown. But often it's like you got some solid suspects, you got some relevant evidence, and the story is coming together, but you're coming up short of the standard that's being applied to you, appropriately applied to you by the prosecutor, right?
Right.
That is, have you beyond a reasonable doubt, have you substantiated that this person engaged in these elements of this crime? And I'd say that most of the cold cases, not all of them, are well on the road to that. They just can't get there. So What's frustrating is often that could be that missing 30% of data that somehow it just fell through the cracks.
People are dying, people are forgetting, people things. Do you find when you're looking at a cold case that it's best, and we'll move right away from this particular case, but it's best for the person that's reviewing the file that's coming in is utterly independent. It's not best friends with the guy that did the original investigation, not even, say, working in the same unit.
I think so. And I think, and you don't see this often, but I've seen a couple of them where they have dedicated cold case units, and they're usually very, very seasoned investigators, right? And the reason why I think dedicated is better because number one, you're not going to pick them unless they're really good and analytical and thoughtful, can do this. And secondly, they can focus on it, right? Because otherwise what happens is in a fairly larger jurisdiction, they give you 4 cold cases. Well, okay, that's great, but what if you had a bad year and you had 20 more homicides? I can guarantee you the cold case isn't going to get any attention. So yes, I think it's always going to be a matter of budget. I think every police agency would say we do it in a heartbeat if we had the personnel and funding. But that is the ideal for sure, that a dedicated, highly trained, highly skilled, focused group.
Walk me through this. Because of our work here on CrimeWaves, we get, emails coming in. People write to me saying, hey, I really want you to look at this particular death because of, it involves my son or involves somebody like this. What is the first step in a cold case?
Gather everything. It's basically an inventory. What do we have? Because from an evidence point of view, if this thing went to trial, like some of these go to trial, that evidence all ended up in court. I can't tell you how many times evidence gets either lost or destroyed when it's left in the jurisdiction of the court evidence areas. Wow, many examples of that. So the question is, did the evidence that was collected still exist? Is it still testable, or did they consume everything in testing? Has been properly stored? I mean, those are all very important questions. And then it's a matter of, where are all the records? Do we have all the records? Like every report, do we have that? Do we have notes, investigators' notes? So the collection of the data is got to be comprehensive and thorough. And then you start inventorying, what do you have and what are you missing?
Tim, yeah. Here is the part of the podcast which people like the best. That's where the student producer gets to ask questions as opposed to me. Elizabeth has done fantastic work on this. And Elizabeth, as you've been listening to the interview, are there some questions that you'd like to add here now?
Yes, Tim, thank you for being here. First of all, I appreciate your time. But my question for you is, obviously working on cold cases can be frustrating at times, especially when you don't have any leads necessarily. So how do you keep yourself driven and passionate to solve these cases?
It's weird in a way. They've gotten nowhere, right? So there's no hope, and when there's no hope, to me, first and foremost, I worry about the family of the victim, right? They have a need for closure and a right for closure. That's the most important. And then, well, I mean, in theory, you also could have had a wrongful conviction, and that's a horrible, horrible situation as well, right? We've got to get that person exonerated and then go back to square one. And in the case of a serial killer, good heavens, you want to stop it. So that's there, but minus those kind of pressures from investigators, they tend to do this at the end of their career because it's far more relaxing. I mean, it's not this pressure of, I got to get this information, I got to get it now, or my probabilities go down, and there's going to be another one tomorrow and another one the day after that. If cold cases are done, it is a much more cerebral, methodical process, and so you get the right person with the right analytical skill sets and the right level of patience, and I think it's actually not the stressful event. It's a challenge, and we all know that many of them we're probably never going to solve, for a million of reasons, but lack of information being top of that.
Tim, thank you very much.
Exactly. When you and I talked about that, I'd like to make one more comment. I think I missed out on, and I think there was an inference. Well, because these of the lifestyle of these girls, they just didn't get the proper attention. Now, I can't say that that's never true, but I can tell you this, and I will refer it back to these cases, right? None of us that were involved in that even remotely felt that way. And actually, it was quite the opposite because, once we looked at their lives, which were not going well, and the hardships that they were facing, and the families who missed them terribly, and we're hoping and praying for them to turn their lives around. Quite the opposite. We went, we got more engaged with this really stinks, and somebody finally's got to step up and kind of defend and advocate for this person who can no longer do for themselves. So we actually were, if anything, the other way. We were very motivated to solve these cases, right?
Tim, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, it's Declan here. Thank you for listening to this CrimeWaves episode, Highway of Death, about a lonely spot alongside a road here in Connecticut where the bodies of young women and one man were dumped by as yet unknown serial killer. It was produced by my brilliant students, Elizabeth Scalzo and Angie Paulus, and the guest was Tim Palmbach, a former senior investigator in the Major Crime Unit of the Connecticut State Police, and now a professor emeritus here at the University of New Haven. If you found this program interesting, do subscribe, follow us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast. And if you could also take some time to rate and review the program, it would be massively helpful in our building the CrimeWaves program. Thank you. We hope that you join us again for the next episode of CrimeWaves.